Hi, this is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest here in Austin, Texas, and welcome to the podcast. I've had the gift of recovery since December the 27th of 1972. And actually, the guest that I've got on today has been working in the field just about as long as I have. So I'm excited to have him with us. The purpose of these podcasts is really to go a little bit deeper into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, the spirituality, and the psychology that underlie the 12-step process, the whole recovery piece, just to kind of dig in for those of us who are ready for the rest to be revealed. And we're doing a series right now on calling it Challenged. And by that, I'm meaning people who are coming into recovery and have some additional challenges that they are facing. So we did a episode on young people coming into recovery, on gays and lesbians in recovery. And now I want to start tackling some of the minority folks who are coming into the rooms. And my guest, I just couldn't have gotten a more knowledgeable individual on this subject. His name is Mark Sanders. He's a licensed clinical social worker, also a certified addictions counselor. And Mark has written a number of books on recovery, and I will put those into the show notes on this. He has taught at the University of Chicago, Illinois State University, Loyola University in Chicago School of Social Work, and he started a museum. And this was how I originally found him. It's called the Online Museum of African American Addictions, Treatment, and Recovery. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. Really encourage you to go and spend some time there. It's a fascinating work that he's done, and comes at it from a number of angles, from music to videos to in-depth articles and things. And you can get yourself a good education by going to that. So Mark, I want to welcome you to the podcast. Really appreciate your spending some time with us today.
And thank you very much for inviting me, Bill.
All right. I kind of want to start off with how people got into the field, how they got interested in recovery. And yours is, like all of them, a very interesting story. So
yes.
Take us back in time and tell us how this came about for you.
Yeah, so the year was 1982. It was January. I'd graduated from a school called McMurray College, Jacksonville, Illinois. Most people have never heard of Jacksonville, Illinois. And I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I'm standing on the corner of 69th and Halsted on the south side with my resume under my arm, and I see a neon sign that said Youth Center. So I walked in, I said, I have a bachelor's degree in social work from McMurray College. Do you need any counselors? They said, we need a strong male counselor. Bill, I said to myself, I know I'm a male counselor, but I don't know how strong. So they hired me. And it was a program that worked with teenagers around alcohol and other drugs. What I should tell you is that this place where I was hired, it was a storefront, an agency that had no air conditioning in the summer and no heat in the winter. So I was freezing. I was hired in January. I looked over in the corner and I saw some books. I said, why don't you read these books and that'll distract you from the cold? One of the books was written by a woman by the name of Sharon Wickshire called Another Chance.
I knew Sharon personally, yeah.
And that book was about alcoholism in the family. And she was the one that talked about these various roles, the hero, the mascot, the scapegoat, the lost child. And I'm reading this book and I'm like, oh my God, this is my family she's talking about. Mm-hmm. And so that I knew that I was right at home. You know, both of my grandfathers had alcoholism, my great-grandfather had alcoholism, and my father was in the first generation of Americans to die smoking crack cocaine. So that I knew that she was talking about my family, and I'm at home, and this is the work that I was meant to do. That's how it all started.
And you spent the rest of your professional life in it, eh?
Yeah, so this year's my 40th year.
Your 40th.
Working as 40th year as a certified alcohol and drug use counselor.
Yeah, it's my 50th year coming up.
Yes,
so,
well, congratulations. We both celebrate these anniversaries.
we've been down some of the same trails.
Yes.
I know that. So your father died, if I remember your story correctly, crack cocaine, was it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And then your uncle got straight?
Yeah. So the gist of it is that, and again, it was March of '86. I said to my father, I had a man-to-man conversation with my father led by me. I said, Dad, let's talk. It was scary because I never said before, Dad, let's talk. He always said, son, let's talk. And I said that I loved you when you didn't use drugs. I love you, you use drugs, and I wished you'd stop. He said, okay. And that was March of '86. 2 months later, May 29th, 1986, he was found dead in the closet at work. And next to my father was the cocaine plant. But here's the revelation, though. You know, when my father died, I really thought I understood the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our life had become unmanageable. Bill, I had no idea what that term powerlessness meant, what that first step really meant until after my dad died. What I learned that it meant is that you could do the best job at trying to help someone with their recovery, and you have no power whatsoever as to whether or not they'll recover. Basically, you can do the best you can do. The end result of that is that after my dad died, I was clinically free because I said, well, I'm going to do the best I can, but I can't control when and where and if someone gets into recovery. And so it was freeing for me while I was grieving at the same time. So a few months later, my Uncle Isaac went in front of a judge. He said, Your Honor, I don't want to go to prison this time. I want to go to drug treatment. This was right after my father died. And the judge said, look at your rap sheet. You've been committing crimes since you were juvenile. Why should we put you in drug treatment? He said, correct, Your Honor. I've been committing crimes since I was a juvenile. And I'm a jailhouse lawyer. I understand the law. And I'm convinced that based upon what I'm being accused of, you'll put me in prison and you'll let me out according to the law in about February. And it's cold in Chicago in February. I don't own a coat. I'll steal one and I'll be in front of you in March. They put him in treatment. He was the first one in the family to ever go to treatment. And the counselor called his 13 brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles and my mother, and they invited him to participate in family night. They said, we're not going to participate. We don't like him. He owes everybody in the family at least $1. When I was 9 years old, he stole some money from me to buy some heroin. The counselor was persistent. He called back and he said, okay, we have food. They said, we'll be there. So all 13 of his siblings participated. And then the siblings called the nieces and nephews, 26 of us. So 39 of us participated in this family therapy. And he got into recovery. And we count over 36 people in our family who are now in recovery. And it started with one man, my uncle. So I'm a living witness that recovery really is contagious. My whole family caught.
Yeah.
The whole family.
Systems theory is more than a theory. It's a fact.
Yes.
If you can change someone in the family, the dynamics are going to shift. And that's an amazing story.
Yes.
Mark, really
so now when we have these parties, Bill, they're not intoxicated parties anymore. They're not like the kids hanging around while the adults pass out and taking whatever's left. These are sober parties within my family.
Amazing, yeah. It happens in context. You made a statement that addiction grows up, festers in context, and you have to take that context into account when you're coming to recovery.
Yes.
So I listened to one of your talks. You named several things. I wrote them down as things that are really important to understand. And one of them, when we start off, was historical trauma.
Yes.
So for the African American, talk about the trauma that they have been through as a people.
Yeah, so what makes it interesting is that there's so many groups that have experienced historical trauma. Like, for instance, the Europeans, especially the ones who came from England at the turn of the century. Mm-hmm. They weren't from the elite or the aristocracy. They were poor people. Some have been incarcerated, et cetera. So if you think about the 400 years that African Americans have been in the United States. It's been a history of historical trauma. So the first 250 years of our journey here was in chattel slavery, 250 years. And that was followed by the Reconstruction era, following the Civil War. And Bill, you know the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution? It's kind of an interesting amendment. Here's what it reads. The 13th Amendment to the US Constitution says that no one can make another person enslaved, but here's the tricky part of it, Bill, unless they're incarcerated. So that when slavery legally ended, unless they're incarcerated. So when slavery legally ended, like between 1863 to 1865, one of the ways they were able to maintain a system like slavery would be to arrest African Americans, long prison sentences, right, for minor infractions like breaking curfew, throwing a piece of paper on the ground. And once incarcerated, you can keep them there for slave labor, right? So this was after the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War was traumatic within itself. So following the Reconstruction era, there was another era called the Jim Crow era, separate but equal. And that was traumatic. You know, every January, February, we see the footage on television that's during the Civil Rights era of African Americans protesting, fighting for civil rights, and the water holes, being bitten by dogs, beaten by billy clubs, et cetera. So that continued throughout the 60s. And then in the 70s, high unemployment, police brutality, gang violence within the communities themselves, right? More police brutality, right? Just 400 years of trauma. What amazes me is the amount of resilience that has come from that trauma at the same time.
Right. And it's helpful if people understand some of this background. When a patient is coming to treatment or some new person is coming into the rooms of recovery, he's carrying all of that inside of himself. And awareness of that is tremendously helpful.
You know what's interesting, Bill? It's like, so for example, I know that not every African American in this like treatment today is aware of that whole history that I just laid out.
Right.
But what he or she is aware of are like their recent experiences, right? I wrote a piece, Bill, on African Americans, gun violence. The most likely targeted that will be another African American. Most of it we have in our neighborhoods in terms of like gun violence is African American men like shooting and killing other African American men. Sometimes innocent people get hit. People who have nothing to do with it, like women and children, et cetera. But the piece I wrote, it's called Dehumanization, Ignored Losses, right? Rage and Violence. So it goes like this. African American men have lots of what I call dehumanizing experiences, like police stops without probable cause, being followed around stores, right? Supermarkets, being mistrusted, under surveillance, arrests, which in many ways, depending upon one gets arrested, it can feel like a sexual assault, right? So when you've had those dehumanizing experiences, right, then one of the worst things that you can do to me then is to disrespect me, right? Because disrespect, you know, is just, it's the worst thing when I've had dehumanizing experiences. And so, and then there's also the mistrust of institutions, right? And I talk to people a lot about the Tuskegee experiment. You probably remember between the 1930s to the 1970s, there were these African-American men who had syphilis, and they went to the clinics in Tuskegee, Alabama, and they thought they were receiving antibiotics for syphilis. What they were really receiving was a placebo, something like water pills. And what the researchers wanted to discover is how would syphilis spread in the human body if it went untreated? When Congress discovered this, there was laws passed based upon the Tuskegee experiments that said that you cannot do research on human subjects unless you prove that you're not trying to harm them. So if you think about the combination of dehumanizing experiences, right, mistrust of institutions, one of the big fears when COVID-19 reared its head is that African Americans would be slower to go to clinics because of mistrust of institutions. But then what do I want when I show up at a facility, receive help for a substance use disorder? I want to be treated with dignity and respect. And I want to have a humanizing experiences like everyone else. If I don't feel respect, if I don't feel a sense of safety, then that ignites something in my body, memories of historical trauma. And now I'm in a place that's set up to help me, but I'm not quite feeling safe.
You referenced in one of the talks I listened to how important the first several minutes are.
Oh my goodness.
When somebody comes into a treatment facility.
Oh my goodness.
Or into an AA or NA or CA meeting.
Oh, how about it? If I can just share with you an experience, Bill. There was a time when I would go to 12-step group meetings, and I would show you how subtle things are. And it was in one of those towns where I was the only African American that attended meetings, right? And you know, at the end of the meeting, we would say the Lord's Prayer, right? And then there would be followed by a hug, right? And for a long time, every meeting that I attended, when it was time for the hug at the end, the person to my right would hug the person to their right, and the person to my left would hug the person to their left. And I was always the second hug. It's like, kind of like, it's subtle stuff, right? So go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead. You could.
Yeah, but what I put like in that presentation, the first 10 minutes of contact really matters, right? So there was a program that said, Mark, can you help us engage our clients more effectively? And most of their clients were African American. And so they were having a really hard time with engagement. So I asked them, could I sit in the waiting room? Because I wanted to review the agency from the perspective of new clients coming in. So I sat there and I started thumbing through the magazines, right? And there was Good Housekeeping magazine, Oprah magazine, Martha Stewart magazine in the waiting room, right? And I said, wait a minute, you're working with African American Hispanic gang members. Who are these magazines for? It's that little stuff that sends a welcome, like the music coming into the intercom when people sit in the waiting room. Whose culture does that reflect? The pictures on the wall. You might have heard me tell that story about working at an agency years ago. And we received a phone call from a man by the name of Marv Dyson, CEO of WGCI radio station, 107.5 FM at that time, the #1 African-American radio station in the country. He said, we heard that your agency is really good at counseling. We're thinking about hiring you, but we need a tour of the agency. Marv Dyson showed up at the agency and he got off the elevator. He looked at the pictures on our walls. He looked at me. He said, no pictures of African Americans on the wall, no pictures of women on the wall, no contract. He get back on the elevator, he was gone, like that. So for the next 30 years, I'd ask myself the question, when clients show up to receive services, do they look at our walls? Do they look at the pictures? Do they see images of themselves? Do they expect to? The other thing I gave to that agency, after sitting in the waiting room, I said, I noticed that when the men come in to receive services, the first person they're met by is armed security. I said, so these are men that have histories of police brutality, right? You ever think that the first person they greet is armed security? You ever think it might be traumatized? They show up to get help for an illness and they're met by armed security. So no, we had never thought about it. So it really is the little stuff. And I would suggest that engagement doesn't really begin when a client shows up and meets with a counselor. It begins with the phone call.
Right.
Person setting up the first appointment, do they answer in dialogue in a way that says you're welcome here? The receptionist is the first point of contact. How was their greeting? How was their welcome? All of this counts because you and I began talking about historical trauma, right? If it doesn't feel safe and I don't feel welcome, then I'm not gonna feel safe in my body. What's significant about that is that we're learning more and more how trauma lodges itself in the human body. Memories are stored. I don't feel safe, I experience it in my body.
Right, and it's subtle things like that that are so important. When I first came into recovery, we always had a greeter at the door.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
and you all were ahead of your time 50 years ago.
Yeah, 50 years ago. But the person's job was to meet the newcomer, particularly and make them feel welcome.
Yes.
I was in Canada not too terribly long ago. They seem to have maintained that little piece of history in their job assignments for people.
We need
I
that
think
right
it's
now,
so
Bill.
important.
And if
Yeah.
ever there's anyone in an organization that needs to be culturally sensitive, culturally responsive, accepting people regardless of their background, how they're dressed, their style of clothes, the color of their skin, it's the greeter.
That's right.
We need to bring that role back.
Yeah. Talk to me about some of the statistics around addiction within the African American community, because I think it's perceived wrongly.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. So here's what happened. You know, historian William White, you all
I
share
know
those
William. Yeah, I
initials.
knew it.
By the way, there's a few of you Bills that are interested in history. You all don't know each other. You all need to really know each other. Yeah. So William White says, historian William White says, there was a best year to have a substance use disorder in America.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the year when First Lady Betty Ford went on national television and said, "My name is Betty Ford. I'm an alcoholic." So news quickly spread about the First Lady having alcoholism. And Newsweek magazine ran an article that year that said after her declaration that 95% of Americans believed that alcoholism was an illness that should be treated in hospitals, right? A disease. Mm-hmm. Back then, after she made that declaration, the estimates were that insurance companies covered addiction at the rate of 90%, and the government covered like treatment at the rate of 10%. If that was the best day, then historian William White said there's also the worst year. And that year was 1986, the year that crack cocaine replaced marijuana as the #1 street drug. The story I tell people was that, I think it was like 1985, stand-up comic Richard Pryor had freebased some cocaine and he was on fire. He started rolling. The reason he caught fire is because when you freebase cocaine, ether is used, and ether is very flammable. So in 1986, street scientists decided that we needed to have a safer way for people to use cocaine. They took out the ether and they replaced the ether with baking soda, and that was the birth of crack. Of course, the reason they call crack crack is because when baking soda is heated, it makes a cracking noise. Mm-hmm. June 1986, All-American basketball player Len Bias from the University of Maryland was drafted #1 by the Boston Celtics. He was going to team with Larry Bird, Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale, and 4 other Hall of Famers. Now, I live in Chicago. If Len Bias, that All-American, who some people compare him to Michael Jordan, to this day they're debating who was better. If he would have teamed with Larry Bird and McHale, the Chicago Bulls don't win all of those championships in a row. You remember what happened? The day he was drafted by the Boston Celtics, he went to a party that night and he snorted some cocaine. He didn't even smoke it, he snorted cocaine. He had a heart attack and died. And Congress, following his death, intensified the war on drugs. So here are the numbers. In 1985, prior to Len Bias' death using cocaine, there were 400,000 incarcerated individuals in the nation's prison. The war on drugs intensified. It went from 400,000 in 1985 to 1 million by 1995, 2 million by 2005, to today disproportionately like 2.3 million, mostly individuals with alcohol and drug problems. But we've known for a long time that people with addictions don't need to be incarcerated. They need a hug. That's why the most therapeutic part of 12-step programming is the platonic hug, right? And so the face shifted from First Lady of the United States to an African-American male smoking crack. The end result of that is we went from viewing addiction as a nation to a disease to a crime. The criminal justice system became the main place where we started housing people, along with the child welfare system. You know, disproportionately between 1986 and 1996, thousands of women, disproportionately African-American women, had their babies taken away by child welfare if she was known to have smoked cocaine and cocaine was found in the baby's system. So prisons and the child welfare system became the new center of substance use disorders treatment. NIDA produced some studies later that indicated that alcohol does more damage to the unborn fetus than does cocaine. Right. Cigarettes does more damage. But when stigma increases, we take the babies, we put you in prison, etc. So that happened. So, truth be told, is whereas the face of addiction shifted to a first lady to African Americans, right, living in poverty, our rates of substance use is on par with the rest of the population in the United States. Not greater than, but similar to.
Right, right. And with the criminalization of an illness,
Yes.
that also follows you for the rest of your life, doesn't it?
Yes, because what we know, I know there's an African American researcher who said that the felony arrest has a longer term consequence than having a substance use disorder, because you can always get in recovery, but that felony has a way of following you for a long time. By definition, historian William White's research indicates that whenever you have high unemployment, right, or loss of jobs disappear, right, you can always expect to see a stimulant epidemic like crack or meth, or an opioid epidemic like heroin, right? I say in some of my presentations that we can learn a lot from Portugal about how to deal with addiction as it pertains to jobs, right? In Portugal, they once had a president that used to be addicted to heroin. He got into recovery, became the president of Portugal. So he passed some legislation, got legislation passed that said that any company that hires someone in recovery will get tax breaks, right? So they make it easier for you to get a job, right? But in the States with those felony arrests, we make it really, really hard for people to become gainfully employed. And what does work do? It gives your life purpose, a sense of meaning. I'm happy to report that just this week, the governor of Illinois passed some legislation that said that any company that hires someone with mental health and addictions recovery will get a $2,000 tax break. I wish he would have increased it, but that's a good thing, right? Because work gives life meaning and purpose.
Spirituality, speaking of meaning and purpose, I'd like to dig into the spirituality within the Black community, because it's different in some ways, particularly when it comes to the church and the role of the church. And I got sober in Detroit, you know,
nice.
And back in '72, burned out city, and man, it was tough. A tough population.
Right.
My best African American story is that I went to an AA meeting one night. There was 75 African Americans in the meeting, and I was the only white guy.
Yes.
And I got a feeling for what that's like.
Yes.
It's intimidating. The beautiful part of the story is how welcomed I was, how addiction transcends so many of those things. And at the end of the thing, we held hands, and there was 76 alcoholics in the group. That's all I can say.
That's the beautiful thing, Bill, because you can go anywhere in the world and feel a sense of kinship and community all over the world as it pertains to like 12-step affiliation, of course. That in itself, I'll respond to your question, is spirituality, right? The nature of it is that you can have all these people from different backgrounds, but when they're in the meeting, it connects them. And it's a beautiful thing. So, historically, when you ask like lots of African Americans, how have you survived everything you survived over the last 400 years, 250 years of slavery, Jim Crow, lynchings, right? Reconstruction era, mass incarceration. Disproportionately, they'll say, God is how I survived. God is how I survived. Yeah. And so, I actually do a presentation on the differences between religion and spirituality. And I'm defining spirituality as connected, and a sense of connected, right?
That's the best definition I've come up with too.
Yes, connected, right? Religion has like rules, right? And doctrines, and things to follow, right? So some people get their spirituality through the church. And there are lots of African Americans, not all, whose spirituality comes through the connectedness they feel in church when the choir is singing, right? When there's dancing in the church and praise worship, right? And others, there's still their fair African Americans who get their spirituality in other ways, like being in nature, right? You asked me about a long-term colleague of yours, and we talked about that long-term colleague of yours being African American. It wasn't the church where he felt the greatest sense of connection. It was through breath work, right? And getting in touch with his breathing, right? So it varies from person to person. But here's something that I'm quite interested in. There's a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And the author of the book talks about historical trauma in African Americans and how trauma lodges itself in the body, right? And so I read his book and another book on trauma by a man named Bessel van der Kolk, one of the nation's foremost authorities on trauma. He too talks about how trauma lodges itself in the body. That's why, Bill, I don't know if you've ever gone to a 12-step group meeting and there's a small percentage of people that struggle with the hug.
Sure.
Yeah, and the traumas in their body, even a platonic hug might feel unsafe. But after I read those two books, I had an epiphany, a moment of clarity. Every Sunday at Black churches, there's lots of dancing, singing, and shouting. A lot of dancing, singing, and shouting. My revelation is that what they're doing in the church every Sunday is removing historical trauma from their bodies through singing and dancing and shouting. So I'm convinced that as a part of our work, we got to ask people, what do they believe in? What sustains them, right? Do they have a religion? How does it help them during difficult times? Is there a spiritual foundation? Do you see your religion and your spirituality as the same? Here's a story for you. There was an African-American woman that I worked with who had polio. And her mother would tell her when she was a little girl, she would run up behind her and push her down and say, get up, life is tough. You know, you got to be able to get up, right? She had a hard time walking. And when her mother wasn't pushing her down, telling her to get up, her father would keep in her room and he would sexually assault his daughter. Well, the long and short of it is the one place where she felt a sense of acceptance is when she went to bars. So from the time she was 13 years old, she would cut school and she'd go to bars. And then she discovered cocaine. So her drugs of choice were cocaine and alcohol. She went into intensive outpatient treatment, and the program called me and said she needs a therapist to work with her one-on-one. And so she's a model patient. She broke all attendance records. She never missed a group. She went to group 5 days a week. She just needs a one-on-one therapist. She told me that now that she's in recovery, she wanted to volunteer more at her church, like a Baptist church. And her minister told her, you can't volunteer because you have crack-addicted demon spirits. Bill, I never heard of such a thing. You have alcoholic demon spirit. I know it's insanity, right? And so she says, I want to get connected to my church. Bill, I looked on the internet and I found 2 meetings at different churches, her denomination, that integrated the 12 steps with the Bible. She was ecstatic. I can't believe this. My denomination, 12 steps integrated with the Bible, right? She went back to the intensive outpatient program and said, listen, I still want to go to group 5 days a week, but instead of going to 4 12-step group meetings in the evening, I want to go to 2 12-step groups in the evening. Then I want to go to these 2 church-based groups. That program discharged her between Christmas and New Year's for doing it her way.
Jeez.
I'm like, they said, Mark, what do you think? I said, you don't want to know what I think. I said, you ever think the fact that being a trauma survivor, that she needed to have a say-so in her treatment plan? Even if she were wrong, that would be empowering. And said, we never thought about it, right? And so she needed that. By the way, the reason those groups existed is because between 1986 and 1996, when crack cocaine was a primary drug used in America, insurance companies went from covering addictions treatment at 90%, when Betty Ford said, I'm first lady, I'm an alcoholic, to 10%. Treatment centers across this country closed. Bill, I would bet you that the state you're in right now that it's hard to like name 8 residential treatment programs that survived managed care in the 1980s, inpatient. I can't count but 4 in my state. So the way the African American church responded to the absence of treatment for African Americans when crack was a major problem was that every denomination set up their own church-based drug ministry. Every denomination.
Right.
None of these people in recovery that went to church would go to their pastors and they say, "Pastor, we need a drug ministry," all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
So when that client of mine was ready to go to church and integrate church with recovery, it was there for her.
There are 2 communities that ought to be in sync with one another.
Yes.
And yet it's really hard to get them to do that. That's
and that would be
experience.
Like treatment in the church or recovery in the church?
Yeah, recovery in the church, 12-step communities and the church. Sometimes, you'll church people say, well, if they want it, they can come over here. And AA, NACA people say, I don't want anything to do with those other people.
Well, here's what's interesting in the history. So, Bill, I took the pilgrimage to Akron, and I went into Dr. Bob's house.
His home.
And I got the tour. I visited Henrietta Siebeling's house, and I got the tour. And here's what they told me on the tour, something like this. Alcoholics Anonymous' original origin was in the Oxford Church, the Christian church.
The Oxford group, yeah.
And the Oxford group had 6 steps. They turned those 6 into 12. And so what I learned is that the origins of 12-step recovery was church.
Right.
And I learned in a book by Ernie Kurtz, Ernie Kurtz wrote a book on the history of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Right.
I learned that there was a letter that was written to the president of the Oxford Church that said, in essence, I'm paraphrasing, to the lead of the Oxford Church, you keep the sinners, you give us the drunks, because when you try to make us perfect, we drink. We seek spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. So what I've seen is a lot of African Americans initiate their recovery through traditional 12-step treatment and 12-step routes in the beginning. Mm-hmm. But when you follow up years later, some of them have segued from 12-step, maintaining their recovery in the church. Some go to church and 12-step. As a way of finding your pathway of recovery.
Right. I think the rate is higher amongst women, isn't it? Who gravitate.
Yeah. So again, his historian William White talked about that. Those surveys where Black women were making a segue in the 5th year.
Yeah, that's right.
One reason I personally think that's important is because Alcoholics Anonymous was started in 1935. The big book was written in 1939, 4 years, right? Mm-hmm. If there were African Americans, women in AA back then, what they'd have discovered is that a lot of these women in the 5th year, they're doing something else. Mm-hmm. He calls that shifting allegiance, right? So before he died, Ernie Kurtz wrote a lot about various pathways of recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people in 12-step say we're the only way.
Yeah.
Wilson and the group itself says, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
But we don't live by that.
Right. So sometimes we need to be reminded of what you just said. Ours is not the only way. There are people who have found recovery besides the way we have. We're not debating them. Yeah.
That's right. If it works, we're all for it. And I think Wilson was probably more that way. I don't think he was an AA fundamentalist at heart. He was exploring vitamin B therapy. He was exploring LSD treatment to spark a spiritual experience among people. He was always kind of out on the edge.
Yeah, so we can learn a lot from his journey, that he was open to possibilities.
Absolutely. One other thing I do want to talk about is you make reference to collectivism.
Yes. And
I think that's an important point, that people's recovery does not have to be based on themselves. You got to want it for you. I've had people in treatment when I was doing counseling, they're there because of their son or their wife. And that's a very valid reason to start,
Yes. So if
Collectivism. Talk about that in the African American community.
right, so if you were to look at like any definition like of recovery, it
Right.
uses the word I quite a bit. I did this, I did this, I did this, I did that. But the African American culture, when it's at its best, is a culture of collectivism. There's an African proverb that says, I am because we are, and we are because I am. The individual is connected to the whole, right? Part of what our experience in America did was to kind of separate us from the whole. Then we started coming back in the form of like things like family reunions, right? Block club celebrations. We are connected, right? Take my uncle, the first person to get into recovery in our family. He said at the end of the day, he said, when all of my nieces and nephews showed up and my brothers and sisters showed up, my recovery was initiated by the idea that I can be reconnected to my family, to my tribe, to the people that love me. You know, there's a church in San Francisco called Glide Memorial Church. That was one of the most popular of all the African American drug ministries, right? And you know, Alcoholics Anonymous is anonymous because the first members of AA had reputations to protect. A stockbroker, a surgeon, a lawyer, so they didn't use last names. But at Glide Church, they used first names and last names. They discovered that being visible, what they really needed in recovery, not to hide. And so they would go within the communities and they would say, we can and we do recover, and your community needs your recovery as an extra motivating force. Our community needs you. Right. It needs your recovery.
Yeah. Two things I wanted to get to. One, just a short story, but there was a counselor at the treatment center that I got sober at and then worked at in Detroit. His name was Clark Newton, African-American guy, street guy, smart guy. After a few years of working with him, I said, Clark, how come you're living over on that end of town?
Yes.
Why not? You can afford to live on this other end of town, can't you?
Yes.
He said, oh yeah, I can afford it. But let me tell you, that's where I drank, that's where I used, and people know me and they see me changed.
Wow.
And that's really important.
He's walking hope.
Yeah, exactly.
Just his presence. And you know what's interesting is that there's probably 100,000 guys from communities who wound up early on being seen as a part of the problem, but now the solution, and they instill hope. Just their mere presence instills hope. What I also I found interesting is that I've paid a close attention to like African Americans in long-term recovery. Right. And almost always as a part of that recovery, you know, first you get sober and you maintain it a day at a time yourself. Then you start like being an asset to your family, your immediate family, your extended family, the block that you live on. But almost to a person, African American in long-term recovery, they start doing things to uplift the community as a whole, as a part of their recovery. And nowhere have I read about that in the literature, but I just see it. Sometimes they make pilgrimages to Africa in long-term recovery to learn about their African origins, and then they bring that knowledge back to the community. It's the most amazing thing to witness.
People have to find pride and love of self.
Yes.
And it's one of the most difficult things. As a culture, we're just terrible at it.
Yes.
You know? Talk to me a little bit about Frederick Douglass. I came across him on the museum site. I was not aware of his story.
Yeah.
Share that.
Yeah. So some historians would call him the first prominent, like well-known, famous.
Yeah. Sure.
Recovering, you know, from alcoholism. And I speak on him in prisons, right? There are lots of African Americans say, you saying Frederick Douglass is one of us? He was traumatized during slavery. So he had, even when he was free, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which he medicated with alcohol. And what he wrote was that he believed that alcohol was used to control the slaves. He said they would beat us Monday through Friday, work us to death, Then they would allow us to drink on Saturday. The idea being that once we tasted alcohol, which would be the medicine for our trauma, we would never want to escape. Frederick Douglass says it wasn't the intoxicated enslaved that was most feared. It was a sober-minded slave. So back then, there was no Alcoholics Anonymous. Frederick Douglass's pathway of recovery was refusal to drink that which was used to keep them in bondage. And so he stopped drinking, right? Mm-hmm. He was one of the leaders of the Black temperance movement. You know, Martha Washington was one of the leaders of the temperance movement, but because of the separation of the races, he couldn't join that movement. So what he did, he went throughout Europe telling his recovery story. In order to keep it, you've got to give it away. Mm-hmm. He did it in Europe. You could easily find it. It's on the website as well. I think his lead being given in Scotland, where he talked about the reason he gave up alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Malcolm X was also an addict.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece and I do a presentation on the recovery pathways of Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass. Very non-traditional, right? An example. So Malcolm X, his whole thing was closer to the way Bill W. got into recovery than people might know. He was addicted to cocaine, heroin, alcohol. He's in prison. There was a Muslim in the movie by Spike Lee, they called him Baines. Baines said, Malcolm, you need to get on your knees to pray to God to take away this urge to drink and use drugs. He was going through withdrawal in prison. And Malcolm X said, the only time I got on my knees is when I was picking a lock to break in somebody's house. Mm-hmm. Baines left, and a white light appeared over Malcolm X. He had spontaneous recovery.
Yeah.
I read that the same thing happened when Ebby left Bill W.'s room. Spontaneous recovery. Happened pretty quickly. That's right. Then he wound up, and so, but the way they maintain their recovery, in order to keep it, you've got to give it away. Frederick Douglass was one of the leaders of the Black temperance movement to promote abstinence, right? And then Malcolm X, in his recovery, he became an advocate for millions. He also started a program called Fishing for the Dead, where he and members of the Nation of Islam, right, will go into prisons and help men and women turn their life around, right?
Right.
Matter of fact, they achieved a lot through that movement. There was outreach to Malcolm X, which played a major role in his transformation, his recovery.
Mm-hmm. It's acceptance of you as a person that is so important. And I think we've lost that. It's just like in the faith traditions. We've made it about believing this, that, or the other thing.
Yes.
It didn't have a damn thing to do with that in the beginning. Had to do with people are loving me. They're accepting me. I'm finding a home here. That's what people are looking for.
Right. Bill, I suggest to people that, in my opinion, that the greatest gift that Alcoholics Anonymous gave to the world, in my opinion, is the concept of a loving God. There's only one authority, a loving God. And I say that because in many ways, many religions have us afraid of God. Like God is over our shoulder about to get us for things that we've done through an act of addiction, right? But A says, no, God loves you. Profound. Yeah.
And if your concept of God as a lover doesn't work, you got to change that concept.
Matter of fact, Bill, I was giving a speech to a group of individuals in early recovery, and they said, you keep saying God loves alcoholics. How do you know that? I said, God loves alcoholics so much that God allows alcoholics to experience something that's called the blackout. So they don't even remember everything they did when they were drinking. All that embarrassing stuff. Does God love drug addicts? I said, no, God loves those who use heroin because Jesus rose from the dead one time. And yet I've seen heroin users OD and come back.
Yeah.
5, 6, and 7, and 8 times. Yeah, I believe that we are God's people. I do.
I do as well. I want to talk a little bit about rites of passage and the role of the father in the family. And that seems to be another place where African Americans are at a real disadvantage.
Yeah. So those friends of mine that I was talking with you about who entered long-term recovery, again, part of it is like more and more work, right? So first I get into recovery. It's hard enough to do this a day at a time, right? It's the first 100 years of recovery that's the most difficult. Then they start wanting to do things for the community, and they say, well, who am I as an African being? So they made journeys to Africa, me and my buddies in long-term recovery, and then have learned about rites of passage. My definition of rite of passage is a culturally prescribed ritual that transitions boys into men and girls into women. It mostly disappeared.
Yes.
So today a man might be a guy that can guzzle whiskey, right? And that kind of thing, drink heavy without getting drunk, right? That type of thing. So what we've done is learn about these ancient rituals of defining manhood and womanhood, and we brought them into big cities, Chicago, Memphis, Detroit. And these men in recovery and these women in recovery are leading these groups. There's, again, like the year I was born, Bill, 90% of Black families had a mother and father in the home, right? Bill, you go to a party and you ask a man who he is, he'll tell you what he does. What happens with us as men is across cultures, right? When jobs go away, sometimes we go away. We stay numb in order to cope. So the numbers have shifted. Some studies will say that today in 2022, something like a third of Black families have a father that's in the home. And for a lot of young people, I should say that fatherlessness is a crisis across the country, because the average for a lot of kids is 50%. Black families, it's even higher. But what it does is this. I tell this story, incredible story about this boy who played partnership football, Bill, and he was a fifth-string running back on the team. And so, you don't get a chance to play as a fifth-string running back. You'd have an easy time finding a penny in the Sahara Desert ever getting in the game. So his father died, and they held a funeral on a Friday. And he walked in the locker room the following Saturday morning and said, "Coach, I want to play the whole game." And the coach did what you'd have done, let him play the whole game. His father died. And the boy scored 5 touchdowns. I tell people that the great Walter Payton, Tupelo, Mississippi, Chicago Bear, never scored 5 touchdowns in a football game. Coach said, "What got you? You're a fifth-string running back." He said, "Coach, when my dad was alive, he was legally blind. So I figured that since he died and went to heaven, that he could see me. I wanted him to be proud of me. So I should talk to these African-American males between the age of 5 to 10 years old who didn't have contact with their fathers. Can you find them, Mr. Sanders? Please find them, please." Age 11, "Have you found my father, please?" Age 12, "I think about him all the time." Age 13, "I think about him sometimes." Age 14, "I would never think about him." Age 15, "I wished he were dead." That rage sets in. And what some young men will do is they will medicate that rage, the anger, with the use of alcohol and other drugs. And what about daughters? There's a book written by an African-American woman called Whatever Happened to Daddy's Little Girl, written by a woman who was a writer for the newspaper in Washington, maybe the Washington Post. And she did a bunch of research on what happens to daughters who are deserted by their fathers. And what her research indicated early on, what daughters will do when they're deserted by their father is what she called the search. Knock on the door. Is that my father? The phone. Is that my father coming to see me, right? The search. I sometimes ask women, when does the search end? When the girl is deserted by their father? And Bill, the most common answer is never. The author of the book says daughters who are deserted by their fathers will sometimes go through a period of promiscuity, and it's not so much about sex, it's about magical thinking. If I sleep with all of these people, maybe my father will discover how desirable I am, and maybe he'll come back into my life. Girls deserted by their fathers often date older partners. And this can become her premature entry into sex, into drugs. Girls deserted by their fathers, and this is kind of across cultures, are 140 times more likely to have a baby as a teenager. Her mindset is, my father doesn't love me, but I'll produce this baby that will never be able to leave me. Daughters deserted by their fathers are 6 times more likely to be sexually abused, because predators know when the father's not around. And of course, there's this link between sexual abuse and early heavy substance use. So,
Right.
whereas we see these things across cultures, these individuals in long-term recovery that learned about these rites of passages, the women would lead these groups with the girls, and the men would lead these groups with adolescent males to help them redefine what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, besides heavy alcohol and drug use. Integrating youth culture, hip hop culture, African American culture, the things that we learn from West Africa about African culture into these rites of passage. So these rites of passage would end with weekend retreats, where we would find out, where these young people need to do work, where are they stuck. A lot of times they wanted to work on their relationship with God, their relationship with their mother, disproportionately the relationship that they didn't have with a father, and how they felt about themselves as African American individuals. Experiential in nature, most of the work.
And there's nothing more important than that. This is not a disease of the head. It's a disease of the heart. And that's where we have to meet people. We have to open our hearts.
Yes.
Not our mouths, our hearts, and feel some of their pain, and get in touch with our own, because we don't do a real good job of that ourselves.
Right. So if I had to suggest to you that if there were one quality that clinicians would possess who work with all clients in general seeking recovery, and specifically working with African Americans, which is what we're talking about, it's not so much what we know, but can we approach this work with a loving heart?
That's it.
This is, I care about you. I embrace you. Interestingly enough, when people sense that we care about them in our heart, we can say the wrong thing that's insulting, and the first thing they want to know is, where's your heart?
That's right.
I know you care about me, so that wasn't intentional. This is a teachable moment. Sure.
Yeah, in the Oxford group, they had the thing called the 5 C's. It was kind of how the program worked. And the first C was confidence. You have to gain the confidence of the individual you're working with.
Yes.
And they're not going to be big on trust.
That's
they're
right.
very distrustful. When we come into the rooms, it's look around, because I'm looking for a reason to leave here.
Isn't that something?
I want you to give me one.
That's fascinating, Bill.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yes.
So you got to gain their confidence, and it takes some time.
Right.
And it takes, that you are special.
Yes.
You talked about motivational interviewing as being an important factor. Could
Yes.
you just describe that briefly?
Yeah. So you think about it. When I first became a counselor 40 years ago, and Bill, you 50, I don't know what techniques they had. They had one.
It was confrontational.
Heavy confrontation, right?
Right.
But then in the 1990s, William Miller came along.
I've had him on the show here.
Who developed motivational interviewing. And he says, our research says that the more heavily we confront people without a relationship, the more defensive they become, and the more likely they are to drop out of treatment. We need to relationship first and stay with people where they're at. So what's unique about motivational interviewing is non-confrontational. You meet people where they're at, and you engage them, and you gently guide them, right? So they're in charge and you follow, right? I believe that in this type of work we're talking about, especially cross-cultural work, motivational interviewing is a good thing. You don't take over people's lives, right? And you walk alongside them. They have a voice.
Which is important. I kind of want to direct this to people who are sponsoring, because I think it carries over into that as well.
Right.
That the sponsor is not God, and he's not, and if he takes on the role of God,
oh my goodness,
look out.
Yes.
Yeah. So finding what's positive in a person's life.
Yes. And making sure they have a voice.
Making sure they have a voice. And what does motivate them?
Right.
Why?
Yeah, that's very unique.
Yeah. Yeah. And for different people, it's different things.
Right, for sure.
And you got to find out what that is and
right.
grow it. and grow it, because that's what's going to happen if it's going to last.
Right. That
Is
makes
you
sense.
set people on a journey, and you know, I some of the people who've studied rites of passage, they say what one of the things we've done is we've made it too easy on people. You do nothing and I'm going to give you a token. Well, let's make it a little harder,
Right.
but be with them.
Yes.
But be with them in the journey. You're not going to abandon them, but you're not going to sugarcoat it either. It's
Right.
tough.
And you're going to do it with love so that they know that you care every step of the way.
Absolutely. That is the key element. If you had to give some advice to someone who's in 12 step and perhaps not a member of a minority group, what advice would you give to them in terms of responding to African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans?
Yeah.
Any pointers you might encourage?
Is to pay attention to, like what I mentioned that I experienced early on, of not being the second hug, sometimes the first hug. Then to know, like that experience you had when you went to the meeting in Detroit, and there were like, you were the only, to know this. I think all of us should have an experience in this lifetime of what it feels like to be in the minority, right? Just to know what that feels like. But know that it can be very frightening to walk into a space and the only person that looks like you is you, and how important it is to create a welcome. Just how important that is in every aspect of a meeting, the pre-meeting, the meeting itself, and then the fellowship afterwards, inclusivity. I should tell you, Bill, that I met some of the first African Americans that got into recovery through AA. I met them in Cleveland. We interviewed some of them. And a couple of them said, yeah, we knew Bill W. Tall fellow, right? And what they told me was that they were given the 12 steps and they didn't know how to work them. So in the beginning, they said we were 90% fellowship, 10% steps. So for example, if we had a fish fry on a Friday night, all of us were in recovery, we were AA fish fry. If we played cards, AA poker game, AA party, right? They said we fellowship before we learn how to work the steps. So fellowshipping is an important part of recovery. And if you're coming into a space and you're in the minority, you might feel really anxious in that space until people fellowship, create a sincere welcome.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I think that's really, really good advice. And I think we could all do with a little more sensitivity to the newcomer. And one of the things that they did both in the Oxford group and in the chapter in the Big Book that talks about working with others is to really, really dig in and get to know them. Because they're looking for an excuse not to stay. And
well, I'm still like confidence. The first, what you say of the 5 principles of Oxford House.
Gain their confidence.
And I still am a real fan of the most important part of a meeting is when people get together afterwards and they fellowship.
Oh yeah.
So if somebody's in the minority,
out for coffee or ice cream,
let's invite them along. Yeah. We don't even need to know each other's last name, and we can still fellowship. And that thing that we have in common, the desire to remain sober one day at a time.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. You've been doing this for a long time, Mark. And
you're like you.
Yeah. I've been at it for a long while, and I don't feel like I'm done yet. And I don't think you are.
No, we'll keep going. We'll keep helping the next generation.
And they're coming along. I've got some guys that I'm working with who are really amazing me.
Well, you're helping too, because what's happening is that a lot of the history that you talk about, that you share with me in the questions you asked, there's a new generation of people coming into our profession who know nothing about this history. And I understand that the one way you can build upon a profession is to understand the history of that profession. And so that what you're sharing now is going to help the next generation.
Yeah, and addiction has always been kind of at the forefront of things that work.
Well, I'm happy that we can talk about God.
We're interested in things that work.
Yes. Father Martin said, if you can find the finest ingredients in the world and mix them up and put them in an oven, call it a cake, and if it doesn't rise, it's not a cake. The theory is only valuable, he said, if it really works. I believe that.
The longest journey in the world, 18 inches from the head to the heart.
Isn't that something?
And that's what recovery is really about.
Right.
It's getting down, opening my heart to others and to myself as well.
Right.
And if you do that, it becomes a lifelong journey.
Right.
I'm still interested in recovery. I'm still fascinated by the process. But it isn't just going around the steps thousands and thousands of times. It's about transformation and joining and finding out what your real meaning and purpose is in your life.
Yes.
And you've certainly done that. So,
well, thank you. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you for joining us. I'm going to put some contact information for Mark in the show notes also, and hope people will go to that online museum and spend some time there. Congratulations on what you put together there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And nice meeting you.
Wonderful
fellow
meeting
person
you.
on this journey.
Okay, man. God bless. And
All right, God
thank
bless
you guys
you.
for listening. Keep coming back.